The gunshot that shattered the calm of Willow Creek's Main Street wasn't meant to kill, only to terrify. Rose Ellis kept her eyes forward, her shoulders back, ignoring the jeers and the second warning shot that kicked up dust mere inches from her feet. She'd expected this welcome, or rather, this demand that she leave. What she hadn't expected was the stranger who stepped between her and the growing mob, his shadow falling across her path like an unexpected mercy. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild enough that a woman's reputation could be her only currency or her downfall. "That's far enough," the man said, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs like a knife through butter. "The lady stays." Rose hadn't meant to look at him, didn't want to acknowledge his intervention, but she couldn't help herself. Tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a jawline that could have been carved from granite, he stood like a man who'd seen his share of trouble and wasn't afraid to face more. His trail-worn duster and the well-maintained Colt at his hip marked him as someone familiar with the harsher realities of frontier life. "You don't know what she's done, Quinn," Mayor Simmons called out, his face flushed with righteous indignation. "This woman has no place in a decent town." The man Quinn didn't move. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Mayor, even in your decent town." Rose felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She'd ridden into Willow Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope for anonymity. She hadn't expected defenders, especially not one who seemed willing to face down half the town on her behalf. "She stays with me," he added, the words simple but somehow binding. It wasn't until he turned to her, his expression unreadable but his hand extended in a gesture that couldn't be misinterpreted, that Rose realized she was holding her breath. She hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling fingers in his palm. "Name's Jackson Quinn," he said quietly for her ears alone, "and I reckon you could use a friend right about now." Rose met his gaze, searching for the ulterior motives she'd learned to expect from men who offered help. Finding none, she nodded slightly. "Rose Ellis, and yes, I believe I could." The crowd's angry muttering grew louder and someone shouted, "You're making a mistake, Quinn. She'll bring nothing but trouble." Jackson turned back to face them, his hand still holding Rose's. "Wouldn't be the first time I've been wrong," he called back, "but I'll take my chances." He leaned closer to Rose. "My ranch is about 3 miles outside of town. You're welcome to stay until things cool down." Rose stiffened. "I don't need charity, Mr. Quinn. It's not charity, it's decency." His eyes softened slightly. "And it's Jackson." The crowd wasn't dispersing. If anything, it seemed to be growing larger and more agitated. Sheriff Miller finally pushed his way to the front, his weathered face a mask of disapproval. "Jackson, don't be a fool," he said, keeping his voice low but firm. "You know what they're saying about her." "I know what they're saying," Jackson replied evenly. "What I don't know is if it's true, and until I do, I'm not joining any lynch mob disguised as public decency." Rose flinched at his words. The accusations that had followed her from Denver weren't entirely false, though they'd been twisted beyond recognition. A woman alone, working in a saloon, befriending the wrong man, it hadn't taken much for rumors to transform her into something monstrous. "My wagon's at the general store," Jackson said to her, ignoring the continued protests. "Let's get your things." "This is all I have," Rose replied, gesturing to the small carpet bag at her feet. Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, pity, perhaps, or understanding, but he simply nodded and picked up her bag. "Then let's go." The walk to Jackson's wagon was the longest of Rose's life. Eyes followed their every move, and the whispers seemed to grow louder with each step. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, her spine rigid with the pride that had carried her through worse situations than this. Jackson's wagon was a sturdy, well-maintained affair with a team of matched bays that spoke of careful breeding rather than random acquisition. He helped her up onto the wooden seat with a courtesy that seemed reflexive rather than calculated, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Hold tight," he murmured, and with a flick of his wrists, the wagon lurched forward, leaving the hostile faces of Willow Creek behind. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Rose stared straight ahead, her mind racing with questions and fears. Who was this man? Why had he stepped in? What did he want from her in return? "You can relax," Jackson said finally, breaking the silence. "No one's going to follow us." Rose turned to study his profile, noting the faint lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. "Why did you do that?" she asked bluntly. He kept his eyes on the road. "Do what?" "Defend me. Take my side against people you know, people who clearly think I'm—" She trailed off, unable to voice the accusations that had been hurled at her. Jackson was quiet for so long that Rose thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "3 years ago, my sister found herself in a similar situation. Different circumstances, same judgment. No one stood up for her." He glanced at Rose briefly. She didn't survive it. The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. "I'm sorry," Rose said softly. Jackson nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without inviting further discussion. "The ranch isn't much," he said, changing the subject. "But there's a spare room that's yours for as long as you need it. No strings attached." Rose wanted to believe him. After months of men offering help with expectations attached, the idea of genuine kindness was almost too much to hope for. "Thank you," she said cautiously, "but I can't stay long. I need to find work." "There's plenty of work at the ranch if you're willing," Jackson replied. "I could use help with the cooking and keeping things in order. Lost my housekeeper last month. She got married and moved to California." Rose considered his offer. She'd come to Willow Creek because it was small enough to start fresh, far enough from Denver to escape her past. Working as a housekeeper on an isolated ranch hadn't been her plan, but perhaps it was the opportunity she needed, a chance to regroup before deciding her next move. "I can cook," she said finally. "And I'm not afraid of hard work." Jackson's lips curved in a slight smile. "Never thought you were, Miss Ellis." The road wound through rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, the landscape opening up as they left the town behind. Rose felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders as the distance between her and Willow Creek increased. The air was cleaner here, tinged with the scent of pine and wildflowers, and the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the countryside. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. "That it is," Jackson agreed. "That's why I stayed even after." He trailed off, then continued more firmly. "The land has a way of healing what people break." They crested a hill, and Rose caught her first glimpse of Jackson's ranch spread out before them. It wasn't the largest property she'd seen, but it was well maintained, with a sturdy 2-story house, a large barn, several corrals, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse set a little apart from the main buildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and several horses lifted their heads from a nearby pasture as the wagon approached. "Home," Jackson said simply, guiding the team down the slope toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Rose noticed a tall, lean man emerge from the barn, shading his eyes against the sun as he watched their approach. When the wagon pulled up in front of the house, he sauntered over, his curious gaze shifting from Jackson to Rose and back again. "Didn't expect you back so soon, boss," he said, his accent revealing hints of the deep South. "And certainly didn't expect you'd be bringing company." Jackson set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. "Miss Ellis, this is Caleb Thornton, my foreman. Caleb, this is Miss Rose Ellis. She'll be staying with us for a while, helping out around the house." Caleb touched the brim of his hat in greeting, his expression neutral but his eyes assessing. "Madam, welcome to Raven Ridge Ranch." "Thank you," Rose replied, accepting Jackson's hand as he helped her down from the wagon. Her legs felt unsteady after the long ride, and she was grateful for his support, however briefly offered. "Any trouble while I was gone?" Jackson asked Caleb, taking Rose's carpet bag from the wagon. "Nothing major. That new stallion's still giving us fits, but we'll break him yet." Caleb's gaze flickered to Rose again. "Word travels fast in these parts, boss. Might want to prepare for some questions from the men." Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The men work for me, Caleb. They don't question my decisions." "Just saying it might be wise to get ahead of any rumors," Caleb replied with a shrug. "Town folk were mighty stirred up about the lady's arrival, from what I hear." Rose felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and anger. It seemed there would be no escaping the whispers, even here. "The lady has a name," Jackson said, his tone carrying a warning. "And any man who brings gossip onto my property can find work elsewhere." "Clear," Caleb nodded, accepting the rebuke without offense. "Clear as crystal, boss." He touched his hat again. "Miss Ellis, if you'll excuse me, I've got horses that need tending." As Caleb walked back to the barn, Jackson turned to Rose. "Don't mind him. He's loyal to a fault, just cautious by nature." "He has every right to be concerned," Rose said quietly. "I've brought nothing but trouble since the moment I stepped off that stagecoach." Jackson studied her for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Trouble has a way of finding people regardless of whether they deserve it or not. Come on, I'll show you the house." The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, built of solid timber with a wraparound porch that caught the afternoon sun. Inside, the furnishings were simple but of good quality, a mixture of pieces that suggested they'd been collected over time rather than purchased as a set. It was undeniably a man's home, lacking the feminine touches that might have softened its edges, but it was clean and well-ordered. "Kitchen's through there," Jackson said, gesturing to a doorway off the main living area. "Dining room beyond it. Upstairs are the bedrooms. You'll have the one at the end of the hall. It was my sister's." Rose glanced at him, surprised by this revelation. "I couldn't possibly, it's just sitting empty otherwise," Jackson interrupted. "She would have wanted it used." He led her upstairs, pointing out his own room at the opposite end of the hallway before opening the door to what would be hers. The room was simply furnished with a bed, dresser, washstand, and small writing desk beneath the window. The walls were painted a soft blue, and curtains of faded floral fabric framed the window that looked out over the rolling pastures behind the house. "It's lovely," Rose said honestly, stepping into the room and feeling, for the first time in months, a sense of sanctuary. "Bathrooms down the hall. We've got indoor plumbing, which is more than most places around here can say," Jackson told her, setting her carpet bag on the bed. "I'll give you some time to settle in. Supper's usually around 6, but we can eat whenever you're ready." Rose turned to face him, suddenly overwhelmed by his kindness. "Mr. Quinn Jackson, I don't know how to thank you." His expression softened slightly. "No need for thanks, just make yourself at home." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, it doesn't matter to me. Everyone deserves a fresh start." With that, he left her alone, closing the door softly behind him. Rose sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. She'd arrived in Willow Creek that morning full of hope, only to discover that her reputation had somehow preceded her. The hostile reception had been devastating, but not entirely unexpected. What she hadn't anticipated was Jackson Quinn stepping between her and an angry mob, offering protection and sanctuary to a woman he'd never met. She unpacked her meager belongings, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a small portrait of her parents, both long deceased. At the bottom of her bag lay a folded newspaper clipping, the paper worn from handling. She unfolded it carefully, though she knew the words by heart. Saloon girl implicated in prominent businessman's death. The headline screamed, followed by an account that twisted truth into unrecognizable shapes. There was no mention of Harold Blackwell's unwanted advances, his rage when rejected, or the accident that had sent him tumbling down the stairs to his death. Only innuendo and suggestion that painted Rose as a seductress and worse. She'd been cleared of any wrongdoing. There had been witnesses to Blackwell's behavior, but the damage to her reputation had been irreparable. In the court of public opinion, she was guilty simply by virtue of her occupation and gender. Rose refolded the clipping and tucked it back into her bag. She'd kept it as a reminder of how quickly life could change, how easily the truth could be buried beneath more sensational stories. Now, she wondered if it was time to let it go, to truly embrace the fresh start Jackson had offered. The sound of men's voices drifted up from outside, and Rose moved to the window. Below, in one of the corrals, several cowboys were working with a magnificent black stallion that fought against their attempts to saddle him. Jackson stood outside the fence, calling instructions. Even from a distance, Rose could see the natural authority he carried, the respect the men accorded him. What kind of man was he, this rancher who'd risked his standing in the community to defend a stranger? And how long would his protection last once he learned the truth about her past? These questions followed Rose as she washed away the dust of travel and changed into her cleanest dress. By the time she made her way downstairs, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard visible through the front windows. She found Jackson in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up as he sliced bread at a worn wooden table. "I thought I was meant to be the housekeeper," Rose said, stepping into the room. Jackson looked up, a smile warming his features. "You can start tomorrow. Tonight you're a guest." "I prefer to earn my keep from the beginning," Rose replied, moving to take the knife from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt an unexpected jolt of awareness at the contact. "Besides, I'm a far better cook than I suspect you are." Jackson relinquished the knife with a chuckle. "No argument there. I can manage not to burn most things, but that's about the extent of my culinary skills." Rose surveyed the kitchen, noting the well-stocked pantry and the pot of what appeared to be stew simmering on the stove. "This will do nicely," she said, already feeling more comfortable with a task to focus on. "Do you usually eat alone?" "Usually. Caleb joins me sometimes, but the rest of the men take their meals in the bunkhouse." Jackson leaned against the counter, watching as she moved efficiently around the kitchen. "There's a woman from town who comes 3 times a week to handle the laundry and deeper cleaning, but the cooking's been left to whoever has time." Rose nodded, understanding the situation. A bachelor ranch owner with no female relatives nearby would struggle with domestic matters, especially with a property this size to manage. "How many men do you employ?" 8 full-time, more during roundup and branding. Jackson crossed to a cabinet and took down 2 plates. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's profitable enough." They worked together to finish preparing the meal, falling into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. Rose found herself relaxing in Jackson's presence, his straightforward manner and lack of pretension creating an ease she hadn't experienced in a man's company for some time. Over supper, Jackson spoke of the ranch, its history, the challenges of the past season, his plans for expansion. Rose listened, offering occasional comments but mostly grateful for his willingness to carry the conversation without pressing her for details of her own past. "How long have you been in the West?" she asked finally as they lingered over coffee. "Born here," Jackson replied. "My father came out from Boston in '38, met my mother in St. Louis, and kept moving west until they found this valley. Started with nothing but a claim and a dream." A shadow crossed his face. "They're both gone now. Fever took them in '69. My sister Clara and I ran the place together until 3 years ago." Rose heard the pain in his voice, saw it in the tightening around his eyes. "You don't have to speak of it," she said softly. Jackson met her gaze. "Nor do you have to speak of what brought you here," he replied. "But sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." The offer hung between them, an exchange of truths that neither was quite ready to make. Rose looked down at her coffee cup, tracing its rim with her finger. "Perhaps someday," she said finally, "when we know each other better." Jackson nodded, accepting her answer without pushing further. "Fair enough." He rose from the table, gathering their empty plates. "I've got some paperwork to attend to. Make yourself comfortable. The house is yours to explore." After helping to clean up from supper, Rose found herself drawn to the bookshelf in the living room. It was well stocked with volumes ranging from practical manuals on animal husbandry to classic literature and poetry. She ran her fingers along the spines, pausing at a collection of Tennyson's works. "Clara's favorite," Jackson said from the doorway, startling her. She could recite The Lady of Shalott from memory. Rose smiled, remembering her own schoolgirl fascination with the poem. "She left the web, she left the loom, she made 3 paces through the room," she quoted softly. "She saw the water lily bloom. She saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot," Jackson continued, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. Their eyes met across the room, and Rose felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared appreciation for beauty amid life's harsher realities. The moment was broken by a knock at the front door. Jackson's expression immediately tensed as he moved to answer it. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch, his weathered face grim in the fading light. Behind him, Rose could see several townsmen on horseback, including Mayor Simmons. "Evening, Jackson," the sheriff said, his gaze moving past him to where Rose stood in the living room doorway. "Miss Ellis." "What brings you all the way out here, Sheriff?" Jackson asked, his tone pleasant but with an unmistakable edge. "Town meeting this afternoon," Miller replied. "There's concern about Miss Ellis's presence in the community. Mayor thought it best if we came to discuss the situation directly." "There's nothing to discuss," Jackson said flatly. "Miss Ellis is my employee and under my protection. What happens on my property isn't town business." Mayor Simmons urged his horse forward. "It becomes town business when it affects our reputation, Quinn. We've worked hard to make Willow Creek a respectable place. Having a woman of her background so closely associated with our community undermines everything we've built." Rose felt anger rising within her, hot and fierce. She stepped forward to stand beside Jackson. "You know nothing about my background," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Only rumors and gossip." "We know enough," Simmons retorted. "Word came from Denver about your involvement with Harold Blackwell and his untimely death. A respectable businessman with a wife and children, destroyed by involvement with a saloon girl." Jackson's head turned sharply toward Rose, but she kept her gaze fixed on the mayor. "Mr. Blackwell was not the respectable man you describe," she said quietly. "And his untimely death was an accident witnessed by half a dozen people. I was cleared of any wrongdoing." "Yet you fled Denver," Sheriff Miller pointed out. Innocent people don't usually run. Innocent people often run when they know the truth doesn't matter to those in power, Jackson interjected, his voice hard. Now, unless you have a warrant or specific charges to bring against Miss Ellis, I suggest you leave my property. The sheriff sighed, looking genuinely regretful. No charges, Jackson, but the town council has voted to ban Miss Ellis from Willow Creek. She can't enter town limits. Rose felt the blood drain from her face. Banned from town, it was the final indignity, a public declaration of her supposed unworthiness. That's ridiculous, Jackson said, his anger now evident. You can't ban someone without due process. Council has the authority to protect public morals, Mayor Simmons said smugly. It's in the town charter. Jackson stepped forward, his posture challenging. And if I choose to ignore this? Ban. If I bring Miss Ellis into town myself, then you'll be choosing to stand against the entire community, Simmons replied. Is that really a position you want to take, Quinn? For a woman you barely know, the question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Rose felt sick at the thought of Jackson sacrificing his standing, perhaps even his business relationships on her behalf. You should go, she said quietly to Jackson. I'll pack my things. Jackson turned to her, genuine surprise in his eyes. You're not going anywhere. I won't be the cause of trouble for you, Rose insisted. You've been kind, but this is your home, your community. I can find somewhere else. The lady seems to have more sense than you do, Quinn, Simmons remarked. Jackson ignored him, his attention focused entirely on Rose. This is wrong, he said, his voice low and intense. Running won't solve anything, it'll just confirm their prejudice. Rose met his gaze, moved by his conviction but realistic about their situation. Sometimes running is the only option left. Not this time. Jackson turned back to the men on horseback. Miss Ellis stays with me. She won't enter town if that's your decree, unjust as it is. But she remains under my protection, and anyone who attempts to harm her or drive her away will answer to me. Is that clear? The sheriff nodded slowly. Clear enough. But you're making a mistake, son. Wouldn't be the first time, Jackson replied evenly. Now, if there's nothing else, I believe we're done here. The men lingered a moment longer, as if expecting Jackson to reconsider, before finally turning their horses and riding away. Jackson watched until they disappeared down the road before closing the door and turning to face Rose. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I did. His expression was resolute. I've stood by before while a good woman was judged unfairly. I won't make that mistake again. Rose shook her head, overwhelmed by his steadfastness. You don't even know me. What they said about Denver, about the man who died. Was he the respectable businessman they claimed? Jackson asked. No, Rose answered without hesitation. He was cruel and violent, especially toward women he thought beneath him. That night, he'd been drinking heavily. He tried to force himself on me, and when I fought back, he lost his balance and fell down the stairs. It was an accident, just as I said. Jackson studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. Those 3 simple words nearly undid her. After months of suspicion and condemnation, to be believed without question was almost more than Rose could bear. She felt tears threatening and turned away quickly, unwilling to show such vulnerability. It's been a long day, she said, striving for composure. If you don't mind, I think I'll retire early. Of course. Jackson's voice was gentle, understanding. Sleep well, Rose. As she climbed the stairs to her borrowed room, Rose tried to make sense of the emotions swirling within her. Gratitude, certainly, for Jackson's defense. Fear of what might come next. And something else. Something unexpected and potentially dangerous, a growing attraction to a man who'd shown her more kindness in one day than she'd experienced in years. She couldn't afford such feelings. Not now, perhaps not ever. Her past had taught her that vulnerability led to pain, and trusting too quickly only invited betrayal. Yet as she prepared for bed, Rose couldn't help but replay the moment Jackson had stood between her and the town's condemnation, declaring without hesitation, "She stays with me." No man had ever stood for her that way before. And despite her determination to guard her heart, Rose fell asleep with the memory of Jackson's steady gray eyes offering a promise of safety she'd almost forgotten how to hope for. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Rose rose early each morning, preparing breakfast for Jackson before he headed out to work with his men. She threw herself into the role of housekeeper with determination, grateful for the distraction of physical labor and the satisfaction of bringing order to a home that, while not neglected, had clearly missed a woman's touch. Jackson kept his distance, respectful of her privacy yet unfailingly courteous. He took his evening meals with her, their conversations gradually becoming less guarded as they discovered shared interests in books and music. Sometimes he spoke of his sister Clara, brief mentions that revealed both his love for her and the lingering pain of her loss. Rose listened, offering quiet empathy without pressing for details he wasn't ready to share. A week passed, then two. Rose began to venture outside the house, exploring the immediate surroundings of the ranch. She discovered a small kitchen garden, neglected but still producing, and set about reclaiming it from the weeds. The physical labor under the open sky proved unexpectedly therapeutic, allowing her to work through her troubled thoughts while accomplishing something tangible. It was in the garden that Caleb found her one afternoon, her hands buried in the soil as she transplanted seedlings she discovered struggling beneath the overgrowth. "Miss Ellis," he called, approaching with the cautious respect he'd maintained since her arrival. "Boss asked me to let you know he'll be late for supper. One of the hands got thrown from a horse, nothing serious, but Jackson's taking him into town to see the doctor." Rose nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thank you for letting me know. I hope the man will be all right." Caleb hesitated, clearly wanting to say more but uncertain of his welcome. Rose had noticed his reserved manner around her, a wariness that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with her presence at the ranch. "Was there something else, Mr. Thornton?" she prompted. He shifted his weight, adjusting his hat. "Just wanted to say, the men have noticed the changes around here. The house looking better, the meals improving. It's good to see the place coming back to life." The unexpected compliment brought a smile to Rose's face. "Thank you, I'm glad to be useful." "And," Caleb continued, seeming to come to a decision, "I owe you an apology for my attitude when you first arrived. It wasn't my place to judge." Rose stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "You were concerned for your employer and friend. There's no need to apologize for that." "Maybe not, but I'm doing it anyway." A hint of a smile crossed his usually serious face. "Jackson's a good man, best I've ever worked for. After what happened with his sister, well, he wasn't the same for a long time." Rose felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "What did happen with his sister?" she asked quietly, knowing she was overstepping but unable to resist the opportunity to understand Jackson better. Caleb's expression closed again. "That's not my story to tell, madam. Just know that when Jackson says you're under his protection, he means it more than most men would." With that, he touched his hat and walked away, leaving Rose with more questions than answers. That evening, Jackson returned well after dark, looking tired but relieved. "Daniel's going to be fine," he reported, accepting the plate of food Rose had kept warm for him. Just a dislocated shoulder and some bruises to his pride. Rose poured him a cup of coffee, noting the tension in his shoulders and the shadows under his eyes. "You look exhausted." "Long day," he agreed, offering a weary smile, "but worth it to see the garden coming back to life. You've got a way with growing things." "My mother taught me," Rose said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "We had a small farm in Missouri before she died. I used to help her with the vegetables while my father handled the larger crops." It was the first time she'd volunteered information about her past, and Jackson seemed to recognize the significance. His expression softened. "You must miss them." "Every day," Rose admitted. "But it's been many years now. They both died of fever when I was 16. "And after?" Jackson asked gently. Rose looked down at her hands. "After, I went to live with my mother's cousin in St. Louis. She ran a boarding house and I helped with the cooking and cleaning. When she died 3 years later, I had few options. I could marry a man I didn't love who'd been persistent in his attentions, or I could make my own way." She met Jackson's gaze directly. "I chose independence." "Which led you to Denver," Jackson said, no judgment in his tone. "Eventually." "I worked as a seamstress at first, then as a shop girl. But the wages were never enough to live comfortably, and when I was offered a position serving drinks at a saloon for 3 times the pay." She shrugged. "It wasn't respectable work, but it wasn't what people assume either. I was never." She trailed off, unwilling to speak the word. "You don't need to explain," Jackson assured her. "We all do what we must to survive." Rose felt a weight lift from her shoulders at his understanding. "Caleb mentioned something about your sister today," she said carefully. "He wouldn't elaborate, but I gathered her situation might have been similar to mine in some ways." Jackson's face tightened, but he didn't immediately shut down the conversation as she'd half expected. Instead, he set aside his fork and regarded her thoughtfully. "Clara was 22 when she fell in love with a man passing through town," he said finally. "Samuel Harwood. He claimed to be a businessman from Chicago, here to invest in mining operations. Charming, well-spoken, impeccably dressed." His jaw clenched. "And married, though he neglected to mention that detail." Rose felt a sinking in her stomach, anticipating where the story was heading. By the time his wife arrived looking for him, Clara was already carrying his child, Jackson continued, his voice flat. "He denied everything, of course. Called her a liar and worse. The town, many of the same people who confronted us about you turned against her completely. Respectable families wouldn't receive her. Shopkeepers refused to serve her. The minister suggested she leave town for the good of the community." "What did you do?" Rose asked softly. "I stood by her," Jackson replied, a flicker of old pain crossing his features. "Or I tried to. But I was away when it happened, a cattle drive to Denver. When I returned, I found she'd—" He stopped, struggling visibly with the memory. "She'd taken her own life. Left a note saying she couldn't bear the shame, couldn't bear to bring a child into a world that had already rejected it." Rose reached across the table instinctively, covering his hand with hers. "I'm so sorry, Jackson." He turned his palm up, gripping her fingers tightly. "I should have been here, should have protected her better." "You couldn't have known," Rose said gently. "And grief has a way of clouding our judgment, making options that would normally be unthinkable seem like the only choice." Jackson looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. "Is that why you defended yourself against Blackwell? Because living seemed like the better choice, no matter the consequences?" The question cut straight to the heart of her experience, to the moment when she'd chosen her own survival over social expectations. "Yes," she answered simply. "My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. No one had the right to take it from me, not Blackwell, not the people who judged me after." Something shifted in Jackson's expression, respect, perhaps, or deeper understanding. You're a brave woman, Rose Ellis. Not brave, she corrected. Just stubborn enough to keep going when it would be easier to give up. The connection between them in that moment felt almost tangible. Two souls who had faced society's condemnation and chosen to stand their ground, albeit in different ways. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to their relationship. Jackson began including Rose in conversations about the ranch's operations, valuing her practical suggestions about household management, and sometimes even larger business decisions. Rose found herself looking forward to their evening discussions, the comfortable silence that could exist between them, the occasional brush of his hand against hers as they worked together in the kitchen or garden. It was dangerous territory. Rose knew better than to mistake kindness for deeper feeling, yet she couldn't deny the growing warmth in Jackson's eyes when he looked at her, or the quickening of her own heart when she heard his footsteps on the porch at day's end. Spring advanced into early summer, bringing longer days and the promise of good grazing for Jackson's expanding herd. Rose's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables for the ranch table and even enough extra to preserve for the coming winter. She found satisfaction in this tangible evidence of her contribution, in knowing that her presence made a genuine difference to the running of the ranch. One evening in June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jackson broke their comfortable silence with an unexpected question. "Are you happy here, Rose?" She turned to look at him, surprised. "Yes," she answered honestly. "More than I expected to be." Jackson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the ban the town council placed on you. It's not right that you can't even go into Willow Creek for supplies or church services if you wanted to." Rose had deliberately avoided thinking about the ban, focusing instead on the freedom she'd found within the boundaries of Raven Ridge. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I have everything I need here." "It matters," Jackson insisted. "You shouldn't have to live with such restrictions." "What are you suggesting?" Rose asked cautiously. Jackson leaned forward in his chair, his forearms resting on his knees. "I've been talking with Judge Harrison. He rides circuit through here every few months. He agrees the town council overstepped their authority. There's no legal basis for barring you from Willow Creek without specific charges." Hope flared briefly in Rose's chest, quickly tempered by realism. "Legal or not, the sentiment remains the same. The people there don't want me among them." "Some don't," Jackson acknowledged. "But others might feel differently if they knew you as I do now." Rose felt a blush warm her cheeks at his words, at the implication that he knew her in some meaningful way. "You're very kind, but it's not kindness, Rose," Jackson interrupted, his voice low and intense. "It's truth. You deserve better than to be defined by rumors and others' prejudice." He reached over and took her hand, his touch sending a now familiar warmth through her. "Judge Harrison will be here next week. With your permission, I'd like him to challenge the council's decision formally." Rose looked down at their joined hands, at the strength and gentleness in Jackson's fingers wrapped around hers. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked softly. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice held a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "Because you matter to me, more than I expected, more than might be wise." Rose's heart seemed to stop, then race forward at his admission. She raised her eyes to his face, searching for signs that she'd misunderstood. "Jackson, you don't need to say anything," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I just want you to know that my support isn't simply about righting a wrong or honoring my sister's memory. It's about you, who you are, what you bring to this place, to my life." The sincerity in his eyes made it impossible for Rose to retreat behind the walls she'd so carefully constructed. "I care for you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm afraid of hoping for something that might be impossible." Jackson's hand tightened around hers. "Nothing's impossible if we face it together." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibility. Then, with a gentleness that brought tears to Rose's eyes, Jackson leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss so tender yet so charged with emotion that it seemed to shift the very ground beneath them. When they drew apart, Rose felt breathless, her certainties shaken. Jackson reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "I didn't plan this," he said softly. "Didn't expect to find someone who could make this house feel like a home again, but here you are." Rose leaned into his touch, allowing herself to believe, if only for this moment, that happiness might be possible after all. "Here I am," she agreed. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the world seemingly transformed by the acknowledgement of feelings too long contained. Rose moved through her tasks with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, catching Jackson's eye across the breakfast table and sharing secret smiles that spoke of new understanding between them. As Jackson prepared to head out to check on a section of fencing with Caleb and two other hands, he paused at the kitchen door, watching Rose knead dough for the day's bread. "I'll be back by mid-afternoon," he said. "Maybe we could ride out to the north pasture later. There's a spot there I'd like to show you, wildflowers like you wouldn't believe." Rose smiled at the invitation. "I'd like that." Jackson hesitated, then crossed the room to press a quick kiss to her forehead. "Until then," he murmured, and was gone, leaving Rose with flour-covered hands and a heart so full it threatened to overflow. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the approaching horses. Expecting Jackson's return, she turned with a smile that quickly faded as she recognized Mayor Simmons and three other men from town, including the owner of Willow Creek's largest mercantile. Rose straightened, wiping her hands on her apron and steeling herself for confrontation. "Mayor Simmons," she acknowledged coolly. "Mr. Quinn isn't here at the moment." "It's you we've come to see, Miss Ellis," Simmons replied, dismounting with a grunt. The other men followed suit, forming a loose semicircle that made Rose acutely aware of her isolation. "I believe I'm banned from town, not from receiving visitors," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" Mr. Hollister, the mercantile owner, stepped forward. He was a portly man with small, shrewd eyes and a reputation for driving hard bargains. "We've come with a proposition, Miss Ellis, one that could resolve this unfortunate situation to everyone's satisfaction." Rose raised an eyebrow, skeptical but willing to listen. "What sort of proposition?" "We're prepared to offer you a sum of $500, Mayor Simmons said bluntly. "In exchange, you'll leave Willow Creek territory immediately and permanently. No challenges to the council's decision, no return under any circumstances." The amount was substantial enough to establish herself comfortably elsewhere, perhaps even start a small business. 6 months ago, Rose might have been tempted. Now the offer felt like an insult. "And if I refuse?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Then things will become considerably more difficult," Hollister replied, his tone conversational but his meaning clear. "Quinn may think he's independent, but his ranch relies on business relationships with people in town. Banking, supplies, selling his cattle all depend on goodwill that could easily evaporate." Rose felt cold anger settle in her stomach. "You would punish Jackson for his association with me." "We would protect our community from undesirable influences," Mayor Simmons corrected. "Quinn's a stubborn man, but even he can't stand against economic reality." Sooner or later, he'll see that harboring you costs more than it's worth. The calculated cruelty of their approach, not direct threats against her, but the methodical destruction of Jackson's livelihood, struck Rose with devastating clarity. This was what they'd done to Clara, isolating and pressuring until she saw no way forward. "You disgust me," she said quietly, her contempt evident in every syllable. "You claim to protect morality while threatening a man's livelihood because he showed basic human decency." Mayor Simmons flushed with anger. "Watch yourself, Miss Ellis. Your situation is precarious enough without adding insolence." Rose stood her ground, lifting her chin. "My answer is no. I won't be bought off or intimidated." "Think carefully," Hollister warned. "Quinn may have taken a fancy to you now, but when his cattle can't be sold and his credit at the bank is suddenly restricted, how long before resentment replaces infatuation? How long before he regrets ever having said she stays with me?" The words struck deeper than Rose wanted to admit. Despite the connection she and Jackson had formed, despite his declarations the previous evening, doubt whispered its poison in her ear. Could any man's affection withstand such pressure? Such cost? "You have until tomorrow to reconsider," Mayor Simmons said, interpreting her silence as wavering. "The offer is more than generous considering your history." Rose found her voice again, steely with determination. "Get off this property. Now." For a moment it seemed the men might refuse, might push their advantage against a lone woman. Then the sound of approaching riders drew their attention, and Rose saw relief cross their faces as Jackson, Caleb, and the other hands appeared, returning earlier than expected. Jackson took in the scene at a glance, Rose standing rigid with anger, the town men clustered before her in obvious confrontation. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his expression dangerously calm as he strode toward them. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Mayor Simmons attempted to regain his composure. "Just a business proposition for Miss Ellis, Quinn. Nothing that need concern you." "Anything involving Miss Ellis concerns me," Jackson replied, moving to stand beside Rose. "Especially when it's conducted on my property without my knowledge." Rose felt his hand brush against hers. A silent question. She shook her head slightly. She didn't want to explain in front of these men, didn't want Jackson's reaction to their threats to confirm their power. "Perhaps another time would be more convenient," Hollister suggested, already backing toward his horse. "We'll be in touch, Miss Ellis." "No, you won't," Jackson said, his tone hardening. "Any further communication with Miss Ellis goes through me. Is that clear?" The men exchanged glances, recognizing the futility of continuing the confrontation with Jackson and his men present. They mounted their horses with as much dignity as they could muster. "This isn't over, Quinn," Mayor Simmons called as they prepared to ride away. "Some things are bigger than one man's stubbornness. And some things are worth standing for, no matter the cost," Jackson replied evenly. "Safe journey back to town, gentlemen." They watched in silence as the men rode away. When they were out of sight, Jackson turned to Rose, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right? What did they want?" Rose hesitated. Part of her wanted to protect him from the knowledge of the threats made against his livelihood, to handle the situation herself as she'd always done. But she recognized that such protection was its own kind of dishonesty, a barrier to the trust they were building. "They offered me money to leave," she said simply. $500 to disappear from Willow Creek territory permanently." Jackson's expression darkened. "And if you refused?" Rose met his gaze directly. "They implied they would use their influence to damage your business relationships in town. Banking, supplies, cattle sales, everything." "Bastards," Caleb muttered from where he stood a few paces away, close enough to overhear. The other hands nodded in agreement, their loyalty to Jackson evident. "Did they threaten you directly?" Jackson asked, his voice tightly controlled. "No," Rose answered honestly. "They're too clever for that, it was all implications. Suggestions that your support would eventually crumble under economic pressure." Jackson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "And what did you tell them?" "That I wouldn't be bought or intimidated," Rose said, lifting her chin. "That they disgust me." A smile ghosted across Jackson's face, pride evident in his eyes. "That sounds about right." He looked at Caleb. "Ride into town, find Sheriff Miller. Tell him what happened here. Emphasize that town officials came onto private property to intimidate a woman alone. I want it on record." Caleb nodded, already moving toward his horse. "On it, boss." Jackson turned back to Rose, his expression softening. "You should have waited for me to return before confronting them." "I didn't invite them," Rose pointed out. "And I'm capable of handling difficult men. I've had plenty of practice." "I know you are," Jackson acknowledged, reaching for her hand. "But you don't have to face them alone anymore. That's what I'm trying to tell you." The simple statement touched Rose deeply. For so long she'd carried her burdens alone, fought her battles without support. The idea that someone that Jackson wanted to stand beside her rather than direct or control her was still new enough to feel almost miraculous. "They're afraid," she said suddenly, understanding dawning. "Not just of me or what I represent, but of us together. Of the example we set by defying their judgment." Jackson squeezed her hand. "People fear what challenges their certainties, and nothing challenges certainty like love." The word hung in the air between them, acknowledged for the first time. Rose felt her heart expand with a joy so intense it bordered on pain. "Is that what this is?" she asked softly. "Love?" Jackson's eyes held hers, clear and unwavering. "Yes," he said simply. "For me it is. I love you, Rose Ellis, and I'm prepared to face whatever comes because of it." Rose had thought herself incapable of such vulnerability, such trust, after all she'd endured. Yet standing there in the summer sunlight, with Jackson's hand warm in hers and his declaration still echoing in the air, she knew with absolute certainty that her heart had found its home. "I love you too," she whispered, the words both a revelation and a homecoming. "More than I thought possible." Jackson's smile was like the sunrise, transforming his features with a joy that mirrored her own. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure, and Rose allowed herself to believe that this happiness, however improbable, however threatened, might truly be hers to claim. The town's opposition intensified in the days that followed. Just as threatened, Jackson's credit at the bank was suddenly restricted, and several merchants in Willow Creek found excuses not to fill orders for ranch supplies. Sheriff Miller, while sympathetic to their situation, admitted his hands were tied in matters of private business dealings. "It's not right," he told Jackson during a visit to the ranch, "but it's not illegal for folks to choose who they do business with." Judge Harrison's arrival the following week brought a measure of hope. A stern, silver-haired man with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for impartiality, he listened carefully to Rose's account of the town council's actions and the subsequent threats. "The ban itself is questionable at best," he concluded, closing the legal tome he'd consulted. "Without specific charges or a proper hearing, they've exceeded their authority. I can issue an injunction that would technically allow Miss Ellis to enter town." "But," Jackson prompted, sensing the judge's reservation. "But legal rights and practical realities often diverge," Harrison said bluntly. "An injunction won't change minds or hearts. These people have decided Miss Ellis is a threat to their way of life, their sense of propriety. Such convictions run deeper than law." Rose nodded, having already reached a similar conclusion. So even with an injunction, nothing really changes. Not immediately, the judge agreed, though having the law formally on your side might embolden supporters who have been reluctant to speak up. Are there supporters? Rose asked, surprised by the suggestion. Judge Harrison smiled slightly. There usually are, Miss Ellis. Those who disagree with injustice but fear the cost of opposing it openly. Sometimes they just need a catalyst. That evening, after the judge had retired to the guest room prepared for him, Rose and Jackson sat together on the porch swing discussing their options. We could leave, Rose suggested tentatively. Start fresh somewhere else, where people don't know either of us. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, considering. Is that what you want, to run? No, Rose admitted. But I don't want to see everything you've built destroyed because of me either. Jackson turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. This ranch was my father's dream before it was mine. It represents generations of work, of hope. But it's just land and buildings in the end, Rose. What matters is the life we build, the principles we stand for. His words touched her deeply, yet concern lingered. Your parents would have wanted their legacy preserved. My parents believed in justice above all else, Jackson replied firmly. They taught Clara and me that standing for what's right matters more than prosperity or social acceptance. His expression softened. Besides, there's another option we haven't discussed. Rose raised an eyebrow, curious. What's that? Jackson's hands tightened on hers, his eyes serious but warm with an emotion that made her breath catch. Marry me. The proposal, so simply stated yet so profound in its implications, left Rose momentarily speechless. Before you answer, Jackson continued, know that I'm not asking out of some misguided sense of protection or solution to our problems. I'm asking because I love you, because I want to build a life with you, because I can't imagine my future without you in it. He smiled slightly. The fact that as my wife, the town would find it considerably harder to maintain their opposition is just a fortunate side effect. Rose felt tears gathering in her eyes. Jackson, take your time, he said gently. Think about it. I'll understand if Rose pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping his words. Yes, she said simply, certainly. Yes, I'll marry you. Joy blazed across Jackson's face, and he gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise more binding than any legal document. When they finally drew apart, both breathless and smiling, Rose rested her forehead against his. Are you certain? She whispered. Once done, it can't be undone. There will always be those who remember my past, who judge us for it. Let them, Jackson replied, his voice fervent. I'd rather face judgment with you than acceptance without you. The wedding took place 3 days later, with Judge Harrison officiating in the ranch's front parlor. Caleb stood as witness for Jackson, while Sarah Johnson, the woman who came to help with laundry and had shown Rose consistent kindness, stood for her. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, the traditional vows spoken with a depth of feeling that brought tears to Sarah's eyes and a suspicious brightness to Caleb's. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, Judge Harrison proclaimed, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Quinn. Jackson's kiss was gentle, reverent, a public affirmation of the private commitment they'd already made to each other. As they turned to face their small gathering of witnesses, Rose felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Judge Harrison departed the following morning, carrying with him both the official marriage certificate and a formal injunction against Rose's banishment from Willow Creek. Use it wisely, he advised as he mounted his horse. The law is on your side, but changing hearts and minds takes time and patience. News of their marriage spread quickly through the surrounding area. Some of the ranch hands seemed surprised but accepting, offering awkward congratulations that Rose received with genuine appreciation. Others in the wider community were less approving, and when Jackson and Rose rode into town together a week after their wedding, they were met with a mixture of cold stares and deliberate avoidance. Mayor Simmons emerged from his office as they passed, his face darkening at the sight of Rose on Jackson's arm. "This changes nothing, Quinn," he called. "A marriage certificate doesn't erase what she is." Jackson stopped, turning slowly to face the mayor. "You're right, Simmons. It doesn't change who my wife is, a woman of courage, integrity, and compassion. What it does change is her legal standing and her connection to this community." His voice carried clearly in the suddenly quiet street. "Rose Quinn is my wife and a property owner in Willow Creek territory. She'll be treated with the respect that position deserves, or there will be consequences." The implied threat hung in the air, not of violence but of the economic and legal repercussions Jackson could now bring to bear. As a significant landowner and taxpayer, his influence extended beyond the boundaries of his ranch. "You're making a powerful enemy, Quinn," Simmons warned, though his bluster seemed less convincing than before. "And you're clinging to power based on fear and judgment rather than true leadership," Jackson replied evenly. "People deserve better from those who claim to represent them." He offered his arm to Rose once more, and they continued down the street toward the general store. As they walked, Rose noticed something unexpected: a slight nod from the blacksmith watching from his forge, a small smile from a woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the milliner's shop. Tiny acknowledgments, perhaps, but evidence that not everyone shared the mayor's vehement opposition. In the weeks that followed, these small signs of acceptance gradually increased. The dressmaker who had initially refused to serve Rose relented after her assistant, a young woman who had once been shown kindness by Clara Quinn, threatened to quit. The general store resumed filling the ranch's orders, economic necessity eventually outweighing social disapproval. Life at Raven Ridge settled into a new rhythm, with Rose fully embracing her role not just as housekeeper, but as Jackson's partner in all aspects of ranch operations. Her practical intelligence and careful management of household expenses soon proved valuable to the larger business, and Jackson increasingly sought her counsel on decisions that would affect their future. The first true test of their united front came in late summer, when several influential ranchers from neighboring properties gathered at Raven Ridge to discuss water rights and grazing boundaries for the coming season. Such meetings had traditionally been male-only affairs, but Jackson insisted that Rose join them. "My wife is my partner in this ranch," he said firmly, when one of the older ranchers raised an eyebrow at Rose's presence. "Her insights are valuable to me, and should be to all of us concerned with fair distribution of resources." Rose had prepared thoroughly for the meeting, studying maps and water flow patterns, considering the needs of each property represented. When she suggested a compromise that would benefit the smaller ranches while still respecting the established claims of larger operations, the men listened skeptically at first, then with growing interest as the practicality of her proposal became evident. "Mrs. Quinn makes a compelling argument," Mr. Henderson, the largest landowner after Jackson, finally acknowledged. "I believe we could work with this arrangement." It was a small victory, but a significant one. Rose had been judged not on rumors or past associations, but on the merit of her ideas and her commitment to the community's welfare. As autumn approached, bringing with it the hard work of the fall roundup and cattle drive, Rose discovered another change in her circumstances, one that filled her with both joy and trepidation. The persistent nausea in the mornings, the unexpected fatigue, the sensitivity to certain smells all pointed to a conclusion she could no longer ignore. She confirmed her suspicions with Sarah Johnson, who had experience as a midwife, before sharing the news with Jackson. She chose a quiet evening when they sat together by the fire, his arm around her shoulders as they discussed the day's events. "Jackson," she said during a lull in the conversation, her heart racing with anticipation, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, concern immediately crossing his features at her serious tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" Rose took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly, "in the spring." Jackson's expression transformed, disbelief giving way to wonder, and then to a joy so pure it brought tears to Rose's eyes. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you already, so much." Rose clung to him, allowing his joy to wash away her lingering fears that her past might somehow taint this new life, that the community's judgment might extend to her child. In Jackson's embrace, surrounded by his unwavering love and support, those fears seemed distant and insubstantial. News of Rose's pregnancy spread through the community, eliciting a range of reactions. Some, like Sarah Johnson and Caleb, were genuinely delighted for the couple. Others viewed it with the same disapproval they'd shown toward the marriage itself. But there were also those who seemed to see the coming child as a bridge between past conflicts, a new life untouched by old prejudices, a reason to reconsider entrenched positions. Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife who had been among Rose's most vocal critics, unexpectedly appeared at the ranch one afternoon in late October, a basket of baby clothes in her arms. "These were my children's," she explained stiffly, as Rose invited her inside. "They're just gathering dust now, and I thought, well, a baby needs proper things." Rose accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, recognizing it for the olive branch it represented. "Thank you," she said simply. "Would you like some tea?" The conversation that followed was awkward at times but marked by a cautious civility that would have seemed impossible months earlier. As Mrs. Peterson prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "My husband and I, we were close to Clara," she said, not meeting Rose's eyes. "What happened to her? It affected many of us deeply, perhaps too deeply." She looked up then, her expression troubled. "When you came to town with your history, it stirred up painful memories. That's not an excuse, but perhaps an explanation." Rose nodded, understanding more than Mrs. Peterson might have expected. "Grief can make us fear what reminds us of our pain," she said quietly. "I never knew Clara, but I know she was deeply loved. By Jackson, by this community." "Yes, she was," Mrs. Peterson agreed, her voice softening. "She would have been a wonderful mother." She glanced at Rose's middle, where the slight rounding was just becoming visible. "Perhaps when the time comes, you might allow me to help with the baby. I have experience, and it's not easy, especially the first time." The offer, tentative as it was, represented a significant shift. Rose smiled, genuinely touched. "I would appreciate that very much." Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Raven Ridge in snow and turning the ranch into an island of warmth and activity amid the frozen landscape. Rose's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body changing to accommodate the new life growing within her. Jackson treated her with a tenderness that sometimes made her laugh, sometimes brought tears to her eyes, insisting she rest when she tried to do too much. Reading aloud to her in the evenings, his hand often resting protectively over her expanding belly. Christmas brought an unexpected thawing in the community's attitude. Several families from town, including the minister and his wife, accepted Jackson's invitation to a holiday gathering at the ranch. The evening was marked by cautious conversation that gradually warmed as the hours passed, helped along by Rose's careful hosting and the universal appeal of celebrating new life in the depths of winter. As the guests prepared to leave, Minister Peterson approached Rose, his manner formal but not unkind. "Mrs. Quinn, I wonder if you and your husband might consider attending services on Sunday. Your presence would be welcome." It was the first direct invitation to participate in the town's most significant social institution, and Rose recognized its importance. "We would be honored," she replied, feeling Jackson's supportive presence beside her. Their first Sunday at church caused a minor stir, with whispers following their entrance and several families pointedly moving to different pews. But others nodded in greeting, and Mrs. Peterson made a point of sitting near them, a public alignment that didn't go unnoticed. After the service, as congregants gathered outside in the crisp winter sunshine, Mayor Simmons approached, his expression unreadable. Jackson tensed visibly, moving closer to Rose in a protective gesture that had become instinctive. "Quinn," Simmons acknowledged then with visible effort. "Mrs. Quinn." It was the first time he had used Rose's married name, a small but significant recognition. "Mayor," Jackson replied evenly. "The town council is meeting next week to discuss improvements to the schoolhouse," Simmons said, his tone carefully neutral. "As significant property owners, your input would be relevant, should you choose to attend." The invitation, grudging as it was, represented a concession and acknowledgement that Jackson and Rose Quinn were part of the community's future, whether certain elements approved or not. "We'll be there," Jackson replied, his arm around Rose's waist. "My wife has some excellent ideas about education that the council might find valuable." Simmons's expression suggested he found this prospect less than thrilling, but he nodded stiffly before moving away. "Progress," Rose murmured, leaning against Jackson's solid warmth. "Slow and painful," he agreed with a wry smile, "but progress nonetheless." As winter gave way to spring, the changes in Rose's body accelerated, her belly now proudly rounded, the baby's movements increasingly vigorous. Jackson took to talking to their unborn child each evening, his head resting gently against Rose's stomach as he shared stories about the ranch, his parents, and especially Clara, ensuring that the aunt this child would never meet would nonetheless be a presence in their lives. "She would have loved you so much," Rose overheard him whisper one night, his voice thick with emotion. "Just as we do, just as we always will." The town council meeting had indeed marked a turning point in their relationship with Willow Creek. While not everyone embraced Rose wholeheartedly, the most vehement opposition had gradually subsided, replaced by a tentative acceptance. Rose's thoughtful contributions to discussions about the school, coupled with Jackson's continued economic influence, made them a force that couldn't easily be dismissed or excluded. By late April, with the ranch bursting into spring bloom and new calves dotting the pastures, Rose felt ready for the baby's arrival. Sarah Johnson moved temporarily into the ranch house to be available when labor began, bringing with her decades of experience and a calming presence that reassured both expectant parents. The birth, when it came, was long and difficult. Rose labored through a day and night, her strength and determination impressing even Sarah, who had attended hundreds of deliveries. Jackson refused to leave, remaining close enough to hear Rose's voice but respecting the traditional boundaries that kept men from the birthing room itself. As dawn broke on a perfect spring morning, a new voice joined the household, strong, indignant, and undeniably alive. Sarah cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing the tiny bundle in Rose's exhausted arms. "You have a daughter," she announced, her weathered face soft with joy. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Rose looked down at the miraculous being she had carried within her body, now blinking up at the world with unfocused eyes that already hinted at Jackson's storm-gray color. Overwhelmed with love, she traced a gentle finger along the perfect cheek, marveling at the delicate eyelashes, the tiny rosebud mouth. "Jackson," she called softly, "come meet your daughter." He entered the room hesitantly, his face drawn with worry that transformed to wonder as he approached the bed. "She's perfect," he whispered, sitting carefully beside Rose and reaching out to touch the baby's hand. Tiny fingers immediately curled around his larger one, and his eyes filled with tears. Just like her mother. They named her Clara Rose Quinn, honoring both the aunt, whose memory had in many ways brought them together, and the mother who had defied convention and judgment to create a new life both for herself and now for her child. Word of the birth spread quickly through Willow Creek and the surrounding ranches. Gifts began arriving: handmade blankets, tiny clothes, practical items for baby care. Each represented not just congratulations but acceptance, a community's acknowledgement that life continues, that new beginnings deserve support regardless of past conflicts. Even Mayor Simmons and his wife sent a silver cup, engraved with the baby's initials, a traditional gift that symbolized a child's place within the social structure of the community. Rose recognized it for the significant gesture it was, a formal admission that Clara Rose Quinn was a legitimate part of Willow Creek's future. As spring deepened toward summer, Rose found herself experiencing a contentment she had once thought impossible. Sitting on the porch in the golden evening light, Clara sleeping peacefully in her arms and Jackson beside her, his arm around her shoulders, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Jackson asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That sometimes shame isn't the end of the story," Rose replied softly. "Sometimes it's just the beginning of a better one." Jackson's arm tightened around her. "I'm grateful every day that I was in town when you arrived," he said. "That I had the chance to say she stays with me before I even knew how completely you would change my life." Rose leaned into his embrace, her heart full. "And I'm grateful that you saw beyond what others claimed I was, to who I could be, who I already was, beneath the judgment and the fear." Clara stirred in her arms, making the small, contented sounds that never failed to fill Rose with wonder. This child, born of love and courage rather than shame and secrecy, represented everything Rose and Jackson had fought for the right to define themselves, to create a family based on truth and acceptance rather than appearances and conformity. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had become truly home to Rose. In the distance, the lights of Willow Creek began to twinkle, no longer a place of rejection but simply a neighboring community with which they would continue to build complex, imperfect human relationships. "I love you," Rose said, turning to meet Jackson's gaze. "For standing with me when it would have been easier to step aside, for believing in me when I'd almost stopped believing in myself." "I love you," Jackson replied, his voice deep with emotion. "For bringing light back into this house, for giving me a family I thought I'd never have, for showing me that the heart can heal and grow stronger than before." As darkness settled over Raven Ridge Ranch, Rose Quinn held her daughter close and leaned against her husband's steady strength, secure in the knowledge that love, persistent, courageous, defiant love, had indeed proven stronger than shame, stronger than judgment, stronger than the fear that keeps people apart. Together, they had created not just a family but a testament to the power of standing firm when it matters most, of saying, "She stays with me," and meaning it with every fiber of one's being. And in that quiet moment, with crickets beginning their evening chorus and the first stars appearing overhead, Rose knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the hearts of those who had chosen to love her, just as she had chosen to love them, with a commitment that transcended society's narrow definitions of worth and belonging. Clara Rose Quinn would grow up knowing this truth, surrounded by the living example of her parents' courage and the legacy of the aunt, whose memory had helped bring them together. She would learn that sometimes the most important journeys begin with someone willing to stand against the crowd, to reach out a hand when others turn away, to say with quiet certainty, "She stays with me."